So again, welcome to everyone who's joined. Thank you so much for being here. If we haven't met face to face, my name's Kat Graves, and I'm the local reference group coordinator for the Columbia-Kootenay Headwaters Hydrologic region. And this is the inaugural meeting of the group. At the outset, I want to say that today's meeting represents a preliminary step in piloting what a scientifically based water monitoring approach that reflects local priorities could look like in our era of accelerating climate change. And we know that not all of the voices that need to be heard are here, but we are actively working to ensure that the local reference group is representative of our community's many and varied interests. And we will look to each of you to help us to do so as we move forward with this process. As far as housekeeping goes, we will be recording today's meeting, but if you're comfortable with it, we'd love it if you could keep your cameras on to humanize the Zoom experience. And on that note, since we won't be doing a round of introductions with a group this size, please pop into the chat where you live and your affiliation so that we can all get a better idea of who is in the virtual room. And with that said, I'm going to formally open this meeting by turning things over to my colleagues, Emily Mask, our Applied Reconciliation Coordinator, and Kat Hartwig, our Executive Director. Emily?
Hi, everyone. I would just like to deliver a land acknowledgement on behalf of Living Lakes Canada. We recognize that our organizational work takes place in the traditional territories of many Indigenous people. Living Lakes Canada recognizes the original caretakers of this land, and thus we dedicate our efforts in water stewardship to best serve the interests of these First People.
Okay, so thanks, Emily, for that. I'm just going to take it away. Here's the meeting overview, and it's pretty much self-explanatory. So it's basically the agenda for the day. And then I'll give you a bit of background about Living Lakes Canada. So thanks, Paige. I think Paige is doing the slides, so thanks, Paige. So my name is Kat Hartwig, and I am the Executive Director of Living Lakes Canada. And a bit about Living Lakes Canada. It's an independent charitable organization with the majority of our water stewardship work originating and continuing in the Columbia Basin. Living Lakes Canada is a multi-award winning NGO that facilitates collaboration in monitoring, restoration, and policy development initiatives for the long-term protection of Canada's lakes, rivers, wetlands, and watersheds. We are a leader in the realm of community-based water monitoring, having led water stewardship initiatives for nearly 2 decades and co-hosted a national conference on community-based water monitoring with Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada and ECCC to provide 60 recommendations to the federal government. We've worked on projects across British Columbia and Canada, including in the Canadian Columbia River Basin where we're based. So some of our current projects you can see that are listed here, both national, provincial, and regional in scope. And of interest might be some of the work we're doing on the foreshore inventory management planning, which is a local government tool to inventory biodiversity on the foreshore of lakes. Watershed restoration program we're doing in partnership with various groups such as the Columbia Wetland Stewardship Partnership. The groundwater program is up and running, and we've managed to develop up to 24 observation wells from 2. Kootenay Watershed Science is really about monitoring snow pillow at high elevation and working with the province on that for lake monitoring as well at high elevation. And then we'll talk further today about the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Framework. So next slide, please. Okay, so the impetus and premise for the Columbia Basin Monitoring Framework was based upon reports done for the Columbia Basin Trust by the Pacific Climate Change Consortium in 2006 and in 2013, suggesting that the Columbia Basin was in water data arrears, thus impacting the ability of smaller communities and the ecosystems they depend on to have greater adaptation options with regard to water security. These reports also outlined that the Okanagan Basin was becoming arid and that the Columbia Basin was becoming semi-arid. A 2017 report that was led by Dr. Martin Carver was a Columbia Basin Trust report, also reiterated the lack of water data available for smaller streams, mid to high elevation lakes, snowpacks, groundwater, aquifers, including aquifer size and recharge rates, as well as wetland water data. In other words, essential water information necessary for many communities and their supporting ecosystems is missing. Scientific researchers such as Dr. Dan Moore of UBC released a 30-year study in 2020, which indicates that we're past peak flow in the basin. And Dr. Brian Menuis of UBC North Glacial study indicates rapidly diminishing glacial conditions in the Canadian Columbia Basin. This year, further relevant studies reported that we can anticipate low to no snowpack in the Western US mountain ranges, and that less water will be available from glacier melt than was previously calculated. So recently, I just wanted to also mention the Columbia Mountain Institute just recently and they're currently having CRED Talks, which is a series on climate change funded by Columbia Basin Trust, also emphasizing the urgency of us focusing collective efforts to address climate impacts. So the long-term intention of this project is to help ensure our decision makers and local residents have the water information and the data needed to manage for future water security and for their local watershed health. So on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the project timeline, we have included an open source data. In 2017, we started with an open source data conference with subsequent working groups to determine a wire framework for the Columbia Basin Data Repository. In 2020, we had a gathering with senior hydrologists for a workshop that arrived at consensus to use a water balance approach and develop a terms of reference to establish how priority monitoring needs could be ascertained. And in 2021, the Data Hub was launched and now holds 209 data sets from 40 contributing groups. And we're now at the stage of outlining the next steps to implement the priority monitoring matrix pilot. And that's the main reason why we're here today. And Kat Graves will talk about that later. And just to say on the next slide that our work does align with provincial and federal water priorities, such as the BC Watershed Security Strategy and Fund, which was announced recently, as well as the recent announcement of the Ministry of Land, Water and Resource Stewardship and the pending Federal Water Canadian Agency. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll pass it on to Emily.
All right. As previously mentioned, my name is Emily and I'm the Applied Reconciliation Coordinator with Living Lakes Canada. This is a new role within the organization and I started last September. This role reflects our organizational actions in reconciliation as we wish to reconcile relationships with water and build strategic and impactful relationships with Indigenous groups. And we want to do this to best suit the water priorities of Indigenous people in this land. While there may or may not be Indigenous representation in this or all of the meetings, I am working to incorporate Indigenous voices if they are interested in presenting their water priorities to these objectives and to work to create meaningful engagements on these issues. And back to Kat.
So thanks, Emily. I want to dig a little bit deeper into what Kat H was talking about in terms of the overarching objectives of the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Framework. And those are to establish a unified water monitoring network that is based on a scientific water balance approach, but which is also guided by local priority water monitoring needs. The intention of this framework is also to implement a coordinated and nested water monitoring approach that voids the ad hoc monitoring and increases our economies of scale to improve efficiency, since we know that resources for monitoring are difficult to secure. And finally, and ultimately, the objective is to collectively explore and implement adaptation options for the health of water-based ecosystems that support our community water needs in a climate crisis era. Slide. So to achieve these ambitious goals, we are piloting 3 regions in the basin. Although there are 10 hydrological subregions in the Columbia Basin, and our scientist lead, Amy Goodbrand, will touch on this a little bit in a moment, 3 subregions were picked to pilot this work: the Columbia-Kootenay Headwaters, which is those of us here today, the Elk River Watershed, and the Mid-Columbia-Kootenay. Slide. For these pilot areas, we will be using a priority monitoring matrix, which is a tool to help us prioritize watersheds for monitoring. And it requires both local knowledge and scientific water balance approach to be complete. We know that scientists might approach a project like this from a purely hydrological point of view, but what today and future meetings are about is understanding what the community's water interests and priorities are. So with that said, I am going to pass it over to our science lead, Amy, to provide more context on the hydrologic regions at play. Amy?
Great, thanks, Kat. Okay, yeah, as Kat said, my name is Amy Goodbrand, and I work with McDonald Hydrology Consultants, and we, together with consultation from Martin Carver and Greg Utzig, are working on the technical side of the priority monitoring matrix, and our objectives are to set the monitoring priorities within a scientific framework to answer questions about what we don't know in the Upper Columbia Basin. So previous work has delineated the Upper Columbia into hydrologic regions based on patterns of climate and surface runoff. So for the pilot study in the East Kootenays, we have the Columbia-Kootenay Headwaters, which was actually extended north to include the Columbia River flow to Kinbasket Lake. So the Purcell Mountains are the boundary on the west and the Rocky Mountains on the east. And this region was then further delineated using the provincial data set of assessment watersheds. And these typically have an adverse size of about 50 square kilometers. So part of our work is to collect all the information on past and current monitoring in the area. And this would include stream discharge, lake levels, groundwater levels, climate stations, and water quality sampling points. So for example, this map on the left shows all the stations used to collect snow data. So things like snow pillows, manual snow courses, even snow depth measurements at climate stations. And so we also assess gradients of precipitation and air temperature. So for example, the gradient of color in these watersheds indicates the average amount of precipitation that falls as snow in a year. And so this region shows relatively strong north-south and west-east precip gradients. And then on the right is another example of data that we look at. So this map shows the active and inactive hydrometric stations in the region, and we also pay attention to the length of record in these stations. And we also look at whether the community has been involved in monitoring streams. So all these data help us to conduct an analysis to understand the holes or really the gaps in current climate and hydrometric monitoring. So part of the gap analysis and assessment of the monitoring network includes grouping the assessment watersheds with similar physical characteristics that would influence the runoff response. So we stratify the watersheds based on things like air temperature, precip, geology, elevation, land cover, things like the amount of glaciers, and we group the watersheds into similar types and then make the assumption that they would all have similar runoff response. And the response would be similar to a change in climate or land use disturbance. So from a technical perspective for the priority monitoring matrix, we want to establish a monitoring network that monitors at least one representative watershed of each group, so we can understand the runoff response across the entire region. So with these data, we can then extrapolate the results from one watershed to other watersheds in the same group. So for the Columbia-Kootenay Headwaters, we've stratified the watersheds into 6 groups. And as you can see, some of these one watershed group would be dominated by glaciers. We also have watersheds that represent higher elevation, cooler, wetter conditions in the Purcells versus the Rocky Mountains. We also have a type that represents the lower elevation, warmer, drier conditions that include the Columbia wetlands. So there's lots of variability across this region. And so for that reason, we don't want to put all of the monitoring equipment and invest all that time and energy and money into the same watershed group. What we want to do is to understand the variability across the region and thinking long-term, bigger scale, the entire Upper Columbia Basin. So there are many things that we don't understand in the Upper Columbia, but By setting monitoring priorities within a scientific framework, we can begin to understand or answer questions about what we don't know. So as a result, we can learn, for example, how stream flow differs between a watershed that's wetter and cooler versus a watershed that's warmer and drier. And then project how the stream flow regime may change as precipitation and air temperature changes into the future. Another example is the opportunity to learn the difference in the stream flow regime between a watershed with a glacier versus one without a glacier, and how the timing and the amount of stream flow would change over time. So this knowledge could help us project how stream flow in the summer may change as glaciers melt with a warming climate. And this could also give us some knowledge around understanding how stream flow changes during that low flow summer period that may affect in-stream flow needs for aquatic species or even for people's water supply. And lastly, many of the watersheds in this region have been affected by harvest or bark beetle infestation. So this provides an opportunity to learn about second order controls on runoff, like land cover and land use. So as a result, monitoring a representative watershed in each group would help us to learn how long it takes for these different groups of watersheds to recover after forest disturbance. And then in turn, we can extrapolate that knowledge from that watershed to others in that same watershed group. So that's all that I have about the technical perspective for developing the water monitoring network. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Amy. Now, please do not be intimidated if you aren't a hydrologist or a hard scientist. We've gathered everyone here today because your history with, your use of, or your interest in water has relevance in the decision-making processes about water in our region. You can provide us with invaluable feedback simply by sharing knowledge that will help us identify areas of concern and watersheds of interest for monitoring, as Amy touched upon. So because today is the initial phase of a long-term process, we're going to keep things simple and separate into breakout rooms to answer 2 questions. Slide, please. Each room will have a Living Lakes coordinator who will be your designated note taker and who will report back when we return as a big group. So I'm just going to pass it over to Nicole, who's going to touch on a few technical details, and then we will move into breakout rooms.
Thanks, Kat. So like Kat said, there'll be already be a note taker in each group. I'm going to open the breakout rooms. You'll be prompted to join, and we will keep the rooms open for 15 minutes, and then there'll be a 30-second warning before everyone comes back into the same room. And don't be surprised if Kat is dropping into your room. She'll just move between the different discussions. So I will open the rooms now. Thanks.
Well, I hope the conversations in the breakout rooms went well. It certainly sounded like some interesting points were being raised. And we're just going to go through our Living Lakes note takers and hear back on what was said. You can feel free to take a little bit longer than we did yesterday, LLC folks, because we're way ahead of schedule. So let's hear back from Paige first.
Sure, thank you, Kat. So on the first question, in terms of values for participants in our breakout room, we looked at water supply for drinking, as well as water supply for ecosystems, and then also the kind of the spiritual and cultural values of water for recreation and a sense of place. And then looking at the second question in terms of specific issues facing watersheds, again, looking at water supply and potential maybe unauthorized use of water by residential users or commercial purposes, as well as disturbance and climate change and the impacts that might have on water supply for surface water and groundwater, rising temperatures, and how that might impact the establishment of invasive species, particularly at higher elevations, and then looking at foreshore use as well of our lakes. And I think that is the summary there for our group.
Thanks, Paige. Next up, we have Kyle.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to my group. It was really great. So for the first question for values, we covered a lot of ground that we would expect, like recreation, wetlands and biodiversity, and how it supports other beings. But we did talk about economics, which was unique compared to yesterday's meeting for my breakout room. So we had some values around the financial resources that are generated from the river valley and the hydro, as well as the tourism that brings in. And then also we talked about how water and these rivers are a connecting force, which was a neat point by one of the participants. And then for the second question, for issues, we covered quite a bit again, how people will abuse water, overuse it, or pollute it. We talked about how land use can be very problematic because it can be a fragmented approach, but it all does affect water, and how there can be a lack of education on water and water use. And then we also talked about how restoration activities might miss the target, and that's regarding climate change, how we might restore a system back to what it was, but will that necessarily be useful for what it will be? Those are kind of the highlights on our group.
Thanks, Kyle. Over to Kayla.
Thank you. And again, yeah, thank you to my group. I had a little bit of a technical difficulty, but everyone was great. So similar again, no surprise, but we definitely brought some unique perspectives. I think recreation really stood out. So fly fishing, paddling, just making sure that our water is clean and fresh to be able to support those activities, as well as domestic use, so in our homes, and being sure that we have access to water. Another one was irrigation, so irrigation in our farming and commercial use. So that's what we valued. And then for some of the issues was water jurisdiction and access to that water for those domestic use and for commercial use. Again, also into the future, making sure that we have a clean and abundant water. And we are aware that we're going to be experiencing some more extreme events, so droughts and floods, and that's a concern. Something that stood out that I thought was unique was relationships of our forests to water and how our forests are connected to water. So that's a concern of ours. And then species at risk, so the decline of species in our watersheds.
Thanks, Kayla. Last but not least, we have Emily.
All right. I will try to summarize some of my group's findings that were different from the others. In our group, we discussed the value of water being recognized as its own entity, and that's totally different from the Eurocentric approach to water and thinking that we have kind of control over it. And then redefining the relationship with water to, and that kind of reflects on the personal value piece, where it's like, if you redescribe your relationship with it, then the relationship, everything changes. So yeah, that was a little bit of a take home. We discussed the fisheries values. We discussed recharging groundwater wells as I guess a thankfulness, I suppose. And then the issues facing our watershed, a lot of discussion about hydro activity in the Columbia, the unnatural ways that we are treating it, and how it's impacting the life around it, so animals and plants, and a lot of discussions about climate change and the hydrological processes that are being altered through wildfire and erosion. And then we got into a little discussion after, but I will save that. Okay, that's all for my group.
Okay, great. Thanks, Emily. So Nicole, we are quite far ahead of schedule, so I'm just wondering if maybe we could take 5 minutes to hear from the wider group if there's anyone who doesn't feel like they had a chance to, express something that they really wanted to in this first meeting. And that could be about what you value about water or watersheds in your region, or any really pressing concerns you feel should inform our process as we move forward. So I'll just open it up to the group, and maybe if you want to unmute yourself please feel free to.
And I'll just add to that too. Also, if you need further clarity around the process, since this is very preliminary and it's quite a complex concept. So we're looking to find out where people's, if there's any kind of understanding gaps that we can fill in and clarify for people. So interested to hear that as well, just regards to the scope of the project and the involvement we're looking for.
So Suzanne here. I'm not very good at this. Wait a second. Since I was late, I wasn't not hearing the opening things. But one of the things that sort of been striking me is to find out that, you know, of course, the communities all put their sewage water in here almost always later than the peak flow when they're supposed to do it because they have too much sewage. So it means that I think that during these droughts that we're going to have increasing amount of pollution as well. And I don't know a good summary that we have of that, of what that loading rate might be that coming down into the wetlands or the river, creeks or rivers. But it's certainly the agricultural impacts will be greater, as will, you know, like Radium puts all their sewage, as do all communities. And I don't know what our data are on that. So that's a data gap.
Thanks, Suzanne. If there aren't any further questions or comments, I think we can wrap up, and I will just say thank you to everyone for coming to this meeting. We truly appreciate your participation and hope you choose to continue with this process because your input is invaluable. As I mentioned throughout, today is the first of several meetings of this local reference group. And as we progress, we, you know, will be figuring out this process with you. So we look forward to hearing from you about who isn't here and what worked and what didn't work. And we will be sending out a summary document with group brainstorm notes, as well as a follow-up survey. And a recording of this meeting will also be made available. Although we are still figuring it out, we expect that the next meeting will be in about 2 months from now. So you will receive a communication from me or Nicole once we've finalized a date. So thank you everyone again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Oh, I just want to add one thing with respect to the follow-up survey. So the survey isn't a survey to rate the meeting. It's a more in-depth tool to capture your thoughts on some of the things we've talked about today. So we kept this meeting kind of short and quick just to give people a general overview and a chance to get a feel for the process. But the survey is something that we're hoping you're going to spend a little bit more time with and give it some thought and circulate that to any other people you think could provide some valuable feedback. So along the lines of the information we're looking for, how do we find that information, tools to engage other people in the community, that type of thing. So just thanks in advance for taking a few minutes with that survey when you get it, which would be likely sometime later next week.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, everyone. Thank you again. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.